and I come back to here. And now I'd like to introduce a man who needs no introduction, Professor Balram Singh, the director of the Center for Indic Studies here at UMASS.
It's my great pleasure again to welcome you to this fourth Mahatma Gandhi Distinguished Lecture Series. We normally do it in two editions, evening and the noon. The evening is a bit informal on some interesting topic, and Rajiv Malhotra spoke yesterday on Indo-US relations. Very different kind of insight that he gave us. And we also had a TV interview with him this morning, and now he's really going to speak on, yesterday it was his lens, today is Mahatma Gandhi's lens he's going to put on, and he will be talking about how Mahatma Gandhi would be looking at today's world. And he has a very passionate view about these things that developed over a long period of time of his own intellectual engagement and experiences both in India and the United States. He has been in this country for 38 years, and he is really trained in physics and software engineering, and that he moved into up the ladder of the corporate world, where he was the vice president of ITT, and then he had several of his own adventures, and finally he established Infinity Foundation because he wanted to promote the ideas that he was able to grasp coming from East and West, both sides, both in intellectual training as well as his own, of course, culture and upbringing. And so he established a foundation called Infinity Foundation in 1994, and maybe another 3-4 years after that he continued working for the foundation as well as for his corporate world, and finally he sold all his corporate interests and put a substantial amount of money in the foundation, and he not only started working full-time for the foundation but also helped hundreds of professors and academicians throughout this country and in India as well as some other countries as well, where he has promoted a new way of thinking, a new way of engaging intellectuals, both academic and non-academic, how to see this world and bring together the thoughts. They're not dividing thought, they might appear sometimes. He has a very, what might appear like harsh view, particularly when he looks at academic world and how the academic scholarship has become stagnant. So he has written, I would say, numerous articles, numerous books, and promoted. He has reached a level where people are writing books, writing PhD thesis based on his work that he has established, and he's involved in so many aspects, particularly about scholarship and writing books and bringing out scholarship to the world. And he has a series of books on the contribution of India in science and technology that he has given some of those copies to me. But most interestingly, and I found out this during the interview this morning, that he's very passionate about Mahatma Gandhi and his views. And he's going to talk today, which is so happens that Mahatma Gandhi wrote a book in 1909, and Rajiv is going to base his talk today on that book and how relevant that book was, how out of the box thinking Gandhi had. Of course, that the perspective or context perhaps was different, whatever he wrote, but Rajiv has developed this idea that Gandhi was a person who was extraordinary thinker, and he wasn't a formal professor or scholar, but he was somebody who was in touch with people, and I think Rajiv, to a certain degree, represents that. It's in a different context. He's not fighting for independence or India's independence especially, but he's talking about independence of thoughts. And I think with those words, I would like to now have Rajiv himself present his views, and please help me welcome Rajiv.
Thank you, Balram, for a wonderful, generous introduction. This morning,
I'm delighted to be here for this talk. In the interview that Ram had with me this morning, he asked me about Obama winning the Nobel Prize in light of Obama saying that his mentor or source of inspiration was Mahatma Gandhi, so I thought there's a link there. Actually, my first reaction was utter surprise. And my second reaction was disappointment, because I felt that an award should be given after the accomplishment, not as down payment to encourage the accomplishment. And in doing so, probably the Nobel Prize, Peace Prize, I never thought it was, I mean, I always felt it was political mostly, but it sort of diminished itself a little bit. And I feel that it also diminishes Obama a little bit, because he's a man who has a huge amount of potential and should go for it. And settling for accolades based on political correctness and public relations and so on could detract him from the tough decisions. And I'm hoping that he will not let this award sort of make him into this goody-goody guy that cannot face issues and take tough actions. Because that would be the wrong, that would be sort of a way of diluting him and appropriating him, which I hope will not happen, but we will see. Now, I was in any case going to start talking by mentioning Obama, even before this happened. The fact that Obama, like many Americans, have really admired Gandhi. However, I think one has to go deep into Gandhi's own thoughts, rather than Gandhiism, which is an ism based on people's appropriating him and recontextualizing him for their own purposes. One of the unfortunate things that has happened to Gandhi, this Gandhiism, is the perception that Gandhi was passive. Very often people will say he was a nice guy, passive, you know. Actually, he was one of the most active persons. He was encountering, fighting what he considered to be Dharma, where Dharma is the righteous way, and Dharma is the opposite of that. And he was not afraid of Dharma. His whole life is filled with fighting Dharma in a selfless manner, making all the sacrifices, being politically audacious, politically incorrect, not willing to be appropriated by any institution. The British would have given him any position he wanted. They could have made him viceroy or duke of something or lord of something or whatever the heck he wanted, just to appropriate him. But he was not interested in any post, any official authority post, but working entirely at the grassroots, working in an informal social network, similar to what the internet is doing today, that kind of the equivalent of that without that technology. He was traveling all over India, in touch with the poorest, the grassroots people living in their huts, living in villages. And his idea of civilization was very much the opposite of what Britain represented. He always said that we don't hate the English, we just hate their civilization. And the idea of centralized government, authoritarianism, hierarchy, institutions, those were the things that he opposed. The industry-based consumerism he opposed. And I will talk about some of these concepts. So he was far from being a passive guy. He was one of the most fiery speakers, audacious, challenging the British Empire, challenging judges in courts, challenging the law. He defied the ban that Indians were not allowed to make salt because the British could tax it, because everybody needed it. So he defied it and went and made salt, got arrested, all that stuff. Defied the British import of textiles into India because it was an Indian industry which they had taken to England, and asked people to make their own cloth in India to put power in their own hands. So this confrontational, I think Gandhi was definitely a confrontational person and not a passive person. And an out-of-the-box thinker, very pragmatic. He would look at whatever the situation was, get into it, and so on. Now, one of the books that influenced me, and I wanted to bring a copy, but we have a few, when you have one copy, you keep it. But I brought 200-300 copies and I gave it to my secretary to keep it. Now she's on sick leave, but she put it in off-site storage somewhere, so I couldn't find it. But there's a book called Hind Swaraj. Hind is India and Swaraj is freedom, which he wrote 100 years ago this year, 1909. And I was very disappointed that there is no celebration of that anniversary. No, I didn't see any big seminars, conferences to see the relevance of that book today, which shows how, you know, Gandhi, the name has become a kind of a commodity and a brand name, but the message itself is not what people are talking about. So I wanted to share with you what was in that book and why it's relevant today. The situation that Gandhi found himself in 1909 when he wrote this book is that the British Empire was ruling India in such a way that a large number of Indians had been appropriated to run the British Empire. So the police, the military, and most of the firing at Indian independence fighters, freedom fighters, most of the firing of the British was actually done by Indian soldiers, wearing the British uniform, carrying the British flag. They were working for them. And the whole civil service, the judges, the civil service, the courts, the authority structure was, you know, the British had leverage. For every one Englishman, they had 10, 20, 50 Indians working for them. That was the structure. So he deconstructed how the empire works and was very audacious in challenging other Indians, telling them that they were actually serving the empire that was enslaving them. And if they stopped serving the empire would collapse. It was not self-sustaining. He concluded that the empire was not self-sustaining. Like an organism that gets hold of a host and lives off of the host, the empire was actually surviving and thriving and flourishing because Indians were not only complicit, but actually facilitating it and joining it, because enough Indians would get good offers and they would go for it. So this analysis of another from your own point of view is in the Indian tradition it is called Purva Paksha. Purva Paksha is a Sanskrit term, and it means you know, from your point of view, looking at the other. And the Hindus and Buddhists debated, they did Purva Paksha with each other. The Vedantins debated with the materialists. So in classical India, it was very common, and the normal way of learning your tradition was to engage with others in debate. It was not an attitude of we don't worry about others and everything must be the same. It was definitely an attitude of taking a stand and arguing and debating with other people. So the starting of Gandhi's career is his Purva Paksha of the British. He came to the conclusion that there was, in fact, an ideological clash of civilizations. This is a Gandhian view. In Hind Swaraj, he talks that the English as individuals are fine people, but they're part of a civilization and a certain value system and a certain concept of success, which he was very much concerned about. So there are several things that he was very concerned about. One was the industrial expansion is non-sustainable. He felt that he's one of the first modern environmentalists. He said that this approach to civilization, where you need industrial goods in ever-increasing quantities that are being obsoleted, you need newer ones, and you're depleting the natural resources of the environment. And you're moving people from self-sustained villages into large, giant complexes of cities. You know, he anticipated all these problems and he wrote about them in his Hind Swaraj 100-page book. So he was anti-consumerism. He lived that life himself. He was lived a very humble life with very few things. If you go to the Gandhi Library or Museum in Delhi, where they have his belongings and where he slept, and it was the most humble situation you could find. He had his glasses, he had a pair of sandals, and he had a pen and a couple of clothes, and that's all he owned. And he was fine with that. He just had no ambition to accumulate things. And this is quite different from the so-called Gandhians today, who will go to a conference and give a big talk and all about condemn this and condemn that, and then they drive off in their SUV, you know, back home, and they're not walking the walk, they're sort of talking. And Gandhi's, so the next big point that Gandhi made is that the truth is something you embody. Satya is truth. Satyagraha is a kind of truth struggle for truth. It is not a belief It is not something that happened in history to somebody 2,000 years ago that God came and did this and that and we have to memorize it and believe in it, but it's not happening to me. It's not that. His idea of truth is something you embody. You own it in yourself. You live it. So if you believe that that animals have life and consciousness, and then you should be generous. You should not eat them. If you believe that in being against consumerism, then you shouldn't be a consumerist. So you have to embody the truth, and it's not an ideological proposition that you sign off on. So the idea of embodied truth, and the idea of sustainability, and the idea of what he called ahimsa. Ahimsa means harm. Ahimsa is non-harming. Now people have mistranslated this as being passive, but it's not passive. He's talking about non-harming. And to achieve non-harming, you got to be very active, very confrontational. You got to bring empires and systems down, which are harming. So all of that very interventionist approach of Gandhi is towards bringing ahimsa in the long run. So to bring about ahimsa, you may have to be confrontational, and you may have to engage in fights, and he was willing to do that, and he did that. So the concept of satya, truth, and satyagraha, struggle for truth, based on sustainability, and sustainability based on non-consumerism as a lifestyle. And all this having to be embodied in yourself, and not something you just talk about and pass laws and legislations, and then you go off on a private jet with all kinds of gas being consumed. It's not that kind of, that was not Gandhi's thing at all. So you have to live that life yourself. Now, his idea of himsa is often mistranslated as violence. So ahimsa is translated as non-violence. Actually, harm, himsa as harm, is a much wider category than just physical harm. First of all, himsa is also towards animals, and vegetarianism is a very important quality of ahimsa. And harm also is harm to the environment and to Mother Nature. This is a very deep Hindu idea that Mother of Nature as sacred, God's body in God's form, that is sacred, divine. The whole ecofeminism movement started in the 60s when somebody called Vandana Shiva, an Indian biologist, a Gandhian, brought this idea to and introduced it into the feminist movement in the United States in the 1960s. She was a very big name, very big on the lecture circuit, going around every year. And a lot of the Western feminists got this influence, and it turned into what is now called the ecofeminism movement. So it's a Gandhian influence at one point in time. And I might also add Gloria Steinem, when she had some frustrating situations in her personal life when she was a college undergrad. She had some personal problems that she wanted to sort of run away. So she went to India and lived in an ashram which had women organizing a Gandhian movement, and they would go for long marches and have various causes. And she writes that when she wrote her autobiography, when she turned 60 several years ago, she writes that that was the turning point that gave her a sense of cause, that she should fight for a cause. And she felt that nothing equivalent to this that she found in India was happening in American campuses, that there was not that kind of an activism. So she came back, and inspired by Gandhi, she says that that trip to India, I think she made several of them, that stay was the defining shift in her life. There was a before life and an after life. So that's an example also of a Gandhian transformation, bringing about change in the modern life. But back to himsa, the harming idea. Gandhi felt that if you have vegetarians, it'll be more eco-sustainable. Now you might think it's just out of being loving towards animals, but it's that and more. Today we know that if you take and Gandhi wrote about this, he knew this, but today it's verified that if you take a certain amount of farmland and you cultivate for a vegetarian population versus growing cattle or for slaughter for a meat-eating population, you'll be able to feed about 5 to 10 times as many vegetarians from the same amount of natural resource, land, water, etc., as you would meat eaters. So one of the important contributions to solving the problem of hunger and malnutrition in the world and a growing population is vegetarianism. And this is a very, very important sustainability issue as well. Gandhi's idea of himsa also applied to culture, devastation of cultures, destruction of cultures, cultural genocide. Unfortunately, when the United Nations enacted the laws on genocide, they eliminated the language, the phrase. There were phrases in the definition of genocide. There were phrases which would have also included cultural genocide as genocide. But there were certain countries, the Western countries, did not want genocide to include cultural genocide because presumably they felt they would be guilty of it. So the genocide, as officially defined in the UN law, is such that you can do cultural genocide without a problem. But scholars talk about cultural genocide, and Gandhi talked about it. Cultural genocide means you go and you convert a large number of people to Christianity, for example, and you get rid of that religion, you call it pagan, heathen, throw it out, or you get rid of their language, their dress, their way of life, their customs, their rituals, their symbols. So the whole culture is finished. Even though you haven't harmed anybody physically, you've given them food, you've got them clothes, got them education, got them medical facilities, you looked after the body, physical side. But in terms of who they are, their sense of history, their ancestry, where do they belong, and their relationship with the land, the mountains, the rivers, which is what makes them who they are, all that is gone. You strip them of that, and you alienated themselves from their own physical space and from their own history, and you made them very vulnerable to become your slaves or your mentally colonized people. And that is what this kind of colonization now goes on, far worse than it ever did, even though on the physical level we are supposedly decolonized. And this goes on because the success is equated with becoming English literate, westernized, using the Western idiom, getting recognition, publishing in a Western journal, getting a Western award, could be the Nobel Prize or the Pulitzer Prize or any of those. And the decline of the native language, its categories, its paradigms, all of this is a huge cultural genocide that is now going on a very big scale. And Gandhi wrote a lot about it. He had huge arguments, and there are many hundreds of pages of him lashing out against Christian missionaries. He said, you should be coming and doing selfless work without converting people. If you want to run a school, run a hospital, give them food, do that. But why do you want to use that as a bargaining chip and as pressure to convert them? Because he considered that to be very dangerous, and he was not at all in approval of that. So I'm pointing this out to you to tell you that a large number of people who would respect Gandhi or think they're respecting Gandhi, call themselves Gandhians, are actually violating some of the things that I'm talking about. So they're not sort of living these ideals, they violate them in a serious way. They are part of himsa, which is harming, or if not directly, they're part of institutions, they're part of structures which are causing himsa, while at the same time they would like to utilize the Gandhi brand name for being associated with it. Now, Gandhi's influenced me a lot in my work, and I got inspired by Satyagraha, which is going against a hugely more powerful establishment based on truth. And I did my own Satyagraha against some academic forces that Balram Singh knows about. This is my Satyagraha. In fact, I wrote also this is Satyagraha because this is truth, and I might debate. And if you cannot, then you cannot just dismiss me, throw me out, or call me names. Because then, as a Gandhian, I will use that as an opportunity to make my case even stronger. And that's sort of a methodology that I have tried to use is in the face of odds, in the face of heavy odds against me. Gandhi believed that difference of culture is not to be erased but celebrated. This is also a very old Hindu idea. That, like we don't say there should be just one kind of flower. Why are there thousands of species? We don't say there should be only one kind of tree, the best tree, the one perfect tree, and throw out all the rest of them. And we don't say there should be just one kind of variety of corn or whatever, or one kind of music. So we know that the universe is built on diversity. That's the inherent principle. I mean, every species has subspecies and sub-subspecies, and this just goes on and on. Nor is it a finite set that stays permanent, because this set of this diversity is always shifting and is in a state of flux from one kshan, which means moment, from one kshan to the next. It's never the same. So this idea that things are infinitely diverse in space and in time, and there is worlds within worlds within worlds of diversity, this means that difference is a principle of the universe, and we are not here to homogenize everybody into the one true book of religion or one true way of life or something. We have to respect that just like diversity has been created in or evolved, whatever you want to use, in other realms, so also in culture, so also in belief systems, so also in histories, in ethnicities, in body types, in languages, and all of that. So this there is a psychological condition that I'm actually writing about in my next book, which I call difference anxiety. The difference anxiety is the anxiety that somebody is different from me in some way. So I got to make him like me. Maybe in the old days it was genocide, that these Native Americans are not like us, so we are from Europe, and so there's something wrong with them. Or slavery, because you get rid of them, put them off, put them down. Or apartheid. Nowadays these things are not easy, they're not allowed. But one can say I'll convert him, so at least one issue, one kind of difference goes away, they become more like me. Then the other kind of difference anxiety is where one operates not from a superiority complex to make the other person like oneself, but one operates from an inferiority complex and says, I'm anxious that I'm Indian and I'm not a white guy, so I have a difference anxiety from an inferiority complex. So I've got to mimic and imitate and become like the superior culture to get rid of that difference anxiety, so that I can advance, my opportunities can be better. So difference anxiety can be from above or below. It can be from superiority or inferiority. And if it's from superiority, then you can use power to put the burden of change on the other guy. And if it's from inferiority, you take the burden on your own shoulders, you have guilt, you have complexes, and you're always trying to measure up on somebody else's yardstick and somebody else's standard, and you end up being a mentally colonized person. Now, the reason I say all this is that Gandhi was as different from the English as you could possibly imagine. And he did it on purpose. He wanted to show difference as something nice. So he gave up all his Western ways, British ways. He put on this Indian dhoti, and he had no clothes on top of his chest, and he would walk barefoot, and he would sit on the floor, and he would milk his goat. And even when he went to England and they put him up in Buckingham Palace to have these talks, he took his goat with them on the ship, because that was his way of life. And then he would spin the wheel to make the cloth that he would wear, and get others to do it. And he would speak his own language, and he would live with the poorest people. The media would, all this high-class world media would come and interview him, expecting that he's sitting in some very lofty place, but he'd sit on the floor with some poor guys. He was really in the face different. He was in the face different, trying to say, look, I'm not setting out. I'm different, I'm who I am, and I'm happy, I'm comfortable with myself. I have nothing against you being who you are, and you shouldn't feel bothered with who I am. So I give you respect for being different, and you should respect me for being different. So we have mutual respect for difference, rather than I'm different as a sense of superiority. So he wasn't operating from that premise. So I call it difference without apologies. And this is a quality that Indians need to learn, because Indians have this anxiety that if something is different about them, they quickly start apologizing for it and quickly start disowning it. And it's a problem that the dominant culture creates, but the culture that feels oppressed and dominated, they buy into this, and then that's a mental colonization. and it ultimately this feeling apologetic leads to the erasure of difference and a more homogeneous society, and that is cultural genocide. So another way of saying it is being against sameness. Sameness is a phrase which refers to everything is same. But when you start saying everything is same on whose terms? Is it on my terms or on your terms? So it's on same on somebody's terms. Somebody gets to be the universal man, have the universal history, have the universal set of ideas, have the universal religion. So it is same on their terms. And typically that somebody happens to be the one who got more power. And so sameness is also kind of a form of colonization and the erasure of difference rather than the celebration of difference. So what did Gandhi do about all this? What were some of his tools? Well, I think I mentioned already that he embodied his idea of truth, and that included celebrating his being different in the face and not being bothered. So he was not worried that he's going to be hauled into some court where all these guys, these British guys, will be sitting in their British dress and demeanor, and he'll be walking looking very strange. He's not bothered by that. He said that it's fine. They don't like me, they don't think I'm any good, and if I were to change my demeanor and my clothes, maybe they'll be happy with me. But he was not interested in making them happy. He was more interested in being authentically who he was. But I would say that there's another very important point that often people miss about Gandhi's distinctiveness, and that is his use of Sanskrit words which are non-translatable. He used words like Swadharma, which literally means my dharma, my selfless pursuit of righteousness, which is different than your selfless pursuit, because I have certain qualifications, you have different qualifications, I have certain circumstances, you have different circumstances. So my calling and my passion, my life story, my journey is Swadharma for me, and everybody has to find their own Swadharma. This is a very important educational model today, Swadharma, that you are not teaching everybody the same thing and not trying to have a cookie cutter factory approach of mass producing graduates. You go make them personalize their own education based on what is their Swadharma. So Gandhi believed, we use this term Swadharma a lot. He also used Swaraj, which means freedom and independence. And he would insist that it is not as simple as the regular meaning of independence, because his Swaraj applies at many, many levels of freedom. And there's a difference between freedom to and freedom from. This is a very interesting East-West difference. When people are asked in surveys in the West, when Americans are asked, are you free, or isn't that one of your values, everybody says, yes, it is. And when they're asked, what does freedom mean to you, they will describe, I have freedom to drive a car, I have freedom, I can go anywhere, I have freedom of buying anything I want, I can wear any clothes, I have freedom to speak. That is freedom to. Freedom to do this, freedom to do that, action. Now if you say, are you free from anger? Are you free from want and desire? Are you free from jealousy? I mean, are you free from conditions inside yourself that are driving your behavior in a certain way? That's a whole different kind of freedom. That's freedom from. It means actually really freedom from yourself, or from your habits, or your own ego. So Swaraj is not freedom in the American sense that we are free to, we can go free to this, to that person, or free in the shopping mall, or we can, that is one kind of freedom. But Swaraj is largely freedom from. So Gandhi always worked on achieving that embodied state of being free from things that afflict a lot of people. Then he had this category Satyagraha. There's an interesting scene in Attenborough's movie Gandhi where he goes to a British judge hauls him for something or other, and he says, Mr. Gandhi, what is this Satyagraha that you keep talking about? So he gives him he refuses to translate it. See, this is part of his power. He wants the discourse on his terms. He keeps discussing what it means, but the judge keeps trying to say, well, does it mean this? Does it mean that? And he says, not quite, but So control your categories of discourse. do not leave certain paradigms and frameworks and categories in which the discourse is happening. If you control those few critical categories of discourse, then you have a better chance of getting staying authentic and staying different on your own terms. So then he had another one called Swadeshi. Swadeshi means off the soil, native product. Like today, nowadays, it's very fashionable, I think it must be here also, but in Princeton it's very fashionable that you buy local. You go to the store and you buy local, you buy apples that are grown locally, you buy honey that's made locally, you buy local. That is Swadeshi. This is the Gandhian Swadeshi idea. And he argued all these things, that instead of long distance transportation and things rotting, and then they have to be kept in some various ways, you buy local, and this local thing for that climate, that thing not only is helping the economy, but these are in the climate that you are living and what you are acclimatized to, these are better for you. Nature has grown things in your area that you are to consume. So Swadeshi, whether it is locally made cloth or locally made something else, was very important. And then his idea of Dharma. Then his idea of Samaj, which is a sort of society, and Panchayat, which is the governance, the traditional Indian governance system at the village level is the Panchayat system. So his idea of what India should become after getting rid of the British rule was not that we will become like the British with Indians running it. He was always concerned that we'll end up becoming brown-skinned Englishmen, which unfortunately happened to a large extent. He was really concerned about that. And he always said that if we are going to just adopt British civilization, then they can do a very good job of it. We should just let them stay here. And he didn't want the British as individuals to leave. He said that that civilization should be replaced by his native civilization. In structure, there is a lot of good things in it. And he differentiated the Jati Varna from the caste. And this is what you can do only if you are in control of your own categories and you refuse to translate those categories. So when Gandhi, when people want to sort of domesticate Gandhi, which is what bothers me, the domestication of Gandhi into Gandhianism, where you really don't understand his categories and you really don't embody the Gandhian ethos, but you can talk about it and map all this Gandhi stuff onto vernacular and your own modern discourse categories and say it's all the same. This is actually himsa to Gandhi. It is himsa to Gandhi to take Gandhi's ideas and mistranslate them in this way. And the highest form of this himsa, I feel, is to call him passive and so on and so forth. So there's two final points I want to make which concern things within India that are actually undermining Gandhism, that have undermined Gandhism. One comes from the Hindu tradition itself. There is a very popular and mainstream and a very central spiritual philosophy called Advaita Vedanta, which is non-dualism, which is beautiful. It is often misinterpreted to encourage people towards inaction. But then why was the universe in the first place? I mean, so this whole idea of inaction, passivity, escapism has become a fad, has become very popular. Now the irony is that you'll have these people give you this talk about inaction and transcending and all that. The moment you're asking them to take responsibility, they'll cop out that way. And then they'll go back and then they'll be really hard at negotiating their business deal, making sure if they're a doctor, they're getting all the insurance claims. If they are a parent, they want their kids to do well on their SATs or GREs. If they're a professor, they want to make sure they negotiate their tenure and their next publishing or book grant well and all that. So in terms of their personal selfish life, they are as combative and competitive as they can be. But when it comes to taking on responsibilities for a society or the Dharma, then an easy way to cop out is to quote some Vedanta ideal of being passive, escapist, and not involved and things like that. So this has become a very big syndrome, the kind of Vedanta escapism syndrome. And if you were to actually pursue that Vedanta escapism, there could not be any dharma in the world, there could not be any karma in the world, and you would basically have to be a total renunciant and really do nothing. I'm very glad that one of the lectures that I saw put up, that Jerry put up, which is going to happen, is on the subject of pravritti and nivritti. And pravritti is the path of action, righteous action, and nivritti is the path of withdrawal and inaction. And if I were here, I'd love to interact to see where this guy comes out. The second major tension point within Indian civilization, Indian history, and with respect to Gandhi, is the Nehru versus Gandhi fight. Nehru was his sort of chosen son, his successor. He was prodigy. Nehru looked up to Gandhi as his father figure, but Nehru was the typical, Cambridge University educated Indian, very anglicized in his mannerisms and his ways and his ideals and lifestyle and so on. Interested in getting the Nobel Prize. Nehru, all his life, was just trying to be this world statesman that someday they'd give him a Nobel Prize and so on. And Gandhi couldn't care less about that. And so after independence, there was a Gandhi versus Nehru choice, and unfortunately, from my point of view, India went the Nehru way. So it went into large-scale industries, polluting centers. They brought in a lot of Soviet models of steel plants. The British education system got further, westernized and further alienated from Indian systems. And that's why after independence, there's no yoga in India. You might be surprised why the gurus came here in the 60s. One of the reasons they give, when I interviewed them, is that there was no market for them in India. People all wanted to become westernized and Europeanized. So many of the gurus came here because they found a lot of Americans were interested in their stuff. Now it's kind of going back there also, reviving in a big way. But we lost 60 years of discontinuity from our culture because as free people, we thought that now we're entitled to becoming like second-class British people. We are also entitled to becoming kind of like them, if not exactly like them, at least a bit like them. And that has become a major obsession. That is a Nehruvian twist, the Nehruvian turn in Indian history. Gandhi wanted a whole different approach. He would have wanted villages empowered, not making huge, monstrous, big metropolitan cities like we have, but empower the villages, give them water, so create water projects rather than automobile industry that consumes more fossil fuel, which is what India is doing, building millions of miles of highway, and everybody is very proud there's development going on. I mean, that may be fine for some people, but there isn't enough water in the villages, and there is not enough infrastructure for water development. And if we were to get water to every village and get it year-round in a properly managed system, then you would empower hundreds of millions of poor farmers. You could quadruple the food supply and bring nutrients to them, improve their quality of life. He would have also had Panchayat Raj, which means decentralized governance rather than very centralized power, which tends to become corrupt. He would have wanted traditional education. He would have wanted vegetarianism. So, and in India, and by the way, India is one of the few countries, unlike in the United States where the percentage of people who are vegetarian is going up, you might be shocked that in India the percentage of meat eaters is going up. And the government authorities track it as a sign of progress. That we are now becoming, wow, we're becoming progressive because more people eating meat. And one of the fastest growing markets for cigarette smoking is India, also China, whereas here it's going down. So this obsessiveness of self-alienation based on some kind of a complex is a form of mental colonization. And a true Gandhian ethos would be an antidote to that. And so with that, I'll conclude. Thank you, and I would love to take your questions.
Questions? See if you turn it on.
I can project. Brilliant presentation. Thank you so much. I'm wondering to what extent did his time in South Africa influence his thinking?
To what extent did his time in South Africa influence his thinking?
Yes.
Well, it's very important because in South Africa, he had certain incidents. You know, the famous incident, he was thrown out of a train, even though he had a ticket, because he was not a white guy. A famous incident when they wanted identity cards. Everybody has to carry identity cards who are, you know, not the white color. And he said, let's burn our identity cards in a huge. They made a pile, they burnt it, and they got arrested, and they had the cops with horses beating them up. I think his formative years of rebellion, somehow the voice went off. His formative years of rebellion happened in South Africa. And so that is an important part of his overall journey, and I'm glad you brought it up. And also then his influence on Martin Luther King to bring civil rights in America, because Martin Luther King Jr. went to India in 1956 and stayed in Gandhi ashram for 6 months. And Reverend Jesse Jackson went into India many, many times to study Gandhi's model of civil disobedience and the whole spiritual formula behind it, to bring it back and say, okay, we're going to fight with righteousness. We're going to fight in a dharmic way. So his influence on Lech Walesa in Poland, who overthrew the Soviet regime there and called himself a Gandhian. So there are a lot of these Gandhian examples that we can cite.
I think that one of the things that of difference between the United States and similar countries in India is that when we think of freedom, we think of physical things, freedom, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of travel, all those. And in India, it's more intellectual freedom, freedom of speech. We think of freedom of speech too, but India seems to be more intellectual rather than
You know, it's very interesting, the point you're making is a very excellent point, and just adding to that, when the Soviet Empire was flourishing, or when it was in full swing, it was very common for American critics to say that we need diversity of products, we need many airlines, why just one airline, or we need many kinds of cars, why just one car like they have in the Soviet Union, and we need many brands of breakfast cereal, why just one? Because in the Soviet Union, they had this very centralized thought process that you regulate and you standardize everything. And then I used to say, as a counter to that, that when it comes to religion, then India would say the same thing about American society. That why aren't we able to have a free for all exploration, spiritual exploration? Why can't we have a free for all spiritual exploration where there's real freedom from religious homogeneity? That can be India's gift to the world. Freedom from religious dogma, freedom from an absolute religious history that happened to one people somewhere in the world, and all our religiosity is driven by that one event somewhere. Indians don't believe in that historical absolutism driving their religious freedom today. And that is why there is this concept of Ishta Devta, which means my deity, my chosen deity through which I worship, and my form of worship, my puja, and a whole pluralism of religiosity. This is a very important kind of freedom that India has, which is quite distinct, I would say.
I have heard you said that Mahatma Gandhi had been one of those ecologists, environmentalists, and that was over 100 years ago. My question to you is, how come many of those ideas that were probably 100 years or older was not taking root and has not been promoted by the Indian mind or the people from India, but it has to be promoted by someone else from outside? What is the disconnect, and why we have to depend on somebody else to promote those ideas?
Well, I alluded to that already, that after independence, India took the Nehruvian turn. And Nehru brought the non-Gandhian, Fabian socialism. He brought that from England. So that became the model of progress and how we have to get out of poverty. We have to do the sort of thing that the West did 200 years ago to catch up. So once you start mimicking somebody else in industry and in the system of government and whatnot, education also became like that, because education produces people who fit into those kind of jobs. Once education becomes like that, you just engineering the mind. You're kind of reprogramming the mind to be Eurocentric. So Indians became that way. And the height of that is in the 60s, when the 60s and 70s, when the gurus felt that they had to get out of India and come to the United States and start the New Age and get into this New Age movement and create all these wonderful things which we now have, yoga, meditation and vegetarianism, all that from India came here. And I think 2 generations have gone by since independence, and now the Indians are getting a little more confident because they're doing well in business and they have disposable income and they can travel around the world and they don't feel this that they're poor to the same extent that they used to, at least. I think that also brings about some self-confidence in one's identity and one's sense of history. My concern is that it may actually be too late, because some of the best institutions that were there for continuity of Indian traditions have been decimated. And so while some of us sporadically here and there in isolated situations have this appreciation for Indian civilization, whether it can gain root again remains to be seen. I'm not totally sure that it can, but of course that's what we're going to try.
Yours is an excellent speech. I have one question. Actually, one question bothers me a lot. After independence, you said that India, between Gandhi and Nehru, India favored Nehru. Actually, if I recall, Gandhi declined to become Prime Minister. It was entire India wanted Gandhi to become. When he declined, the Jinnah wanted to become.
Yeah.
At that time, Nehru came, intervened, and then he wanted to become.
Yeah.
Now, my question is that, had Gandhi become Prime Minister, India and Pakistan would not have been separated, right?
Okay, let me just take this. Let's not get into India, Pakistan. Let's talk about Gandhi not becoming Prime Minister. Gandhi never wanted official authority. So it was not the Gandhian way to become king or become president or prime minister anyway. I'm talking about the ethos of the common public. It is not who's prime minister. I mean, the point is, Gandhi's idea of influence was never top-down. So it would not be Gandhian for Gandhi to become prime minister and then run the country with power. It would not be Gandhian, he would betray his thing. So for him to say, I don't want to be anything, and I want no official capacity, was the normal thing to do. The real change is that the Indian National Congress was not intended to be a political party that would rule. Gandhi said that the Indian National Congress should remain a grassroots civic organization, community work, community seva, build up community, be the voice of the people, and not run for office. Sort of like Ralph Nader in this country, called himself a Gandhian. And he has so much to say in favor of Gandhi, and he's into that. And his public interest research group, when I was in college in this country, I was a member of public interest research group, and I was very happy about that. But I felt disappointed when Ralph Nader decided he was going to run for office, because now you're trying to become part of the problem, part of the establishment, and you're no longer objective, and now your ego wants power. So for Gandhi to have taken over power would have been a wrong thing. And if Indian National Congress had not become the political party that wants to govern and so on, I mean, Nehru could have left the Indian National Congress and in his own personal capacity become whatever he wanted to become. But Indian National Congress should have remained a Gandhian grassroots organization. I think that's the real issue. Is a question there? You're all here, this question here.
Thank you for your superb speech. It was marvelous. But I was wondering if I could take you home with me and you could tell my friends, because when I try to speak the same information that you say, they think I'm cuckoo. So I was just wondering if you could back me up. But what I want to ask is, I mean, I had a couple of things rambling around. First off, in the United States, we, celebrated and we blessed ourselves, and we found ourselves so amazing for voting the first black president, who was actually biracial, when that's been done for hundreds of thousands of years everywhere else around the world. I mean, they've had women presidents and prime ministers in some other countries. So when I speak about, when you speak about trying to raise yourself up, and it's not such an important thing, but recognizing that what establishes the person inside is not what's on the outside. I try to encourage, I'm a single parent, and I try to encourage my daughter and her friends to come to my house. I try to let them know they're young women, all around the world. Young women around the ages of 11 are taught to suppress their conversation, but I try to teach them to speak up for what they have to say, ask questions. And then, we're talking about animal rights and vegetarianism, but they say, well, there's so many wild animals like deer and bears and elk that we have to get rid of because they'll overpopulate. So then you present the argument, well, that's because man is expanding beyond what they should. So what is your thoughts on trying to present in a humble, simple, yet powerful, firm way that, we're not amazing when we vote into authority. We're amazing when we do our own voice and when we speak for what we truly believe in. And we're not trying to encourage people to become vegetarians, but we're trying to encourage them to respect. I mean, recently I was in a class where respect was taught as getting somebody to do what you want them to do. And I just found that so amazing, and I almost had to stand up and disagree. So, but I don't know how to do that without coming across as a crazy person, How do you do that?
You see, we are facing such unprecedented combination of catastrophes and dilemmas in this world that hopefully this will force people to think out of the box, and the conventional solutions have reached a cul-de-sac. Many of these conventional solutions, they're either getting you off a cliff or reaching the cul-de-sac. So we won't have the choice of continuing this way. Whether we do it proactively, it's already very late, or whether we just run out of resources and blow ourselves up, or some major things happen, that remains to be seen. And I don't see those with huge amount of influence, whether it is the Pope, whether it is the President of the United States, whether it is the head of the UN, I don't see where there is tremendous centers of influence. I don't see people really doing the Gandhian thing, which would be to just completely think out of the box and forget all this us, them. We're still thinking in terms of the fence to keep the Mexicans out. We're still, it's very interesting. I used to live in San Diego, and there wasn't the fence, but when they would come, the cops would throw them out as illegals and all that. I got to know a lot of these guys, and they are the original inhabitants of that land. There was no dividing between United States and Mexico. It was their land. They are the Native Americans. They are the inheritors of that soil. And they were moving back and forth. So some people came and created this concept, threw them out, and now they're called illegal aliens. This is bizarre stuff. So I don't have a silver bullet to solve this problem, when I've made it my swadharma, my satyagraha, is to investigate, find the truth, and talk about it very courageously and very provocatively in the face, hoping that enough people wake up.
Thank you. It was a very good presentation. My question to you is that India has been ruled by other than Christians for many, many years, and they have made every attempt to convert Hindus to other religions. And as you mentioned, Gandhiji's said he focused only on Christians, that they were trying to convert Hindus to Christians. Why only Christians? Why not other religions?
Yeah. I think Gandhi was a very pragmatist person. I'm giving you Gandhi's reason, not my reason. I would take a different stand than Gandhi on this issue. I would say any religion coming and converting our natives is a bad idea, not just Christians. But Gandhi's reason was he wanted to unify Indians to get rid of the real serious problem, which was the British. And he was willing to compromise internally and give up a lot of space, even though it may not have been that good in the long run. But he was willing to compromise internally in order to have a unified voice of Indians against the British. So therefore, He didn't take on Islamic radicalism, he didn't take on that, he supported the Caliphate movement, which I thought was not a great idea, because we are seeing now the repercussions of that. But at that time he felt that the British were so good at dividing Hindus and Muslims and making them fight, and were so good in this divide and rule kind of business, that unless he could end this divide and rule strategy of the British, undermine it and unify people, he would never be able to get rid of the British. So his was a very pragmatic decision at that moment in time, given the configuration of the chessboard. Today's chessboard is different. So today's Gandhian lens has to look at a different move. You cannot play the same move when the chessboard has changed so much. And now it's a very different chessboard. And now there is radical Islam trying to undermine Indian civilization as much as there is radical right-wing Christianity trying to undermine, and Maoist movement. So there's three big civilizations. They're all carving out a piece of India. There is the Western Christian civilization, there is China, there is Islam. These are the three civilizations carving out the world. And there's just no doubt about that, because each of them has that position as their position. They're not shy of it. You don't have to accuse them. They will tell you that each one of them wants to dominate the world by their own rhetoric. And all three of these, Western Christians, China-inspired Maoists, and Islamists, are very active in India and carving out pockets here and there. I have a book coming out, I've finished the first draft, that talks about this kind of conquest or breakup of India possibility in the not too distant future, because many districts have been taken over by Maoists, many have been taken over by Christians, many have been taken over by Muslims, and this Western secular democracy kind of an idea with no central ethos, just a sort of a universal, generic, we try to be like Europe, does not have the power to hold the nation together. And so this is a major issue that I think you are hinting at, that I feel is the case.
So what is the ratio of Buddhist versus Maoist in China?
I don't know, because everybody I ask give me a different question. People say there is a large percentage of closet Buddhists that are, and the Chinese have actually reopened Buddhist monasteries. They've refurbished them. They've started teaching Buddhism in schools. They have so they are reviving Buddhism because they don't want the Chinese to depend on Dalai Lama for a foreign Buddhist source. They want the authority of Buddhism to be Chinese. And that way, those who want to be Buddhists will have a made in China, controlled by China kind of Buddhism. And they are looking for religion which is part of national ethos of China. So Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism are being offered by the Chinese communists, as opposed to the guy in New York. What was his name? The guy the Chinese didn't like. The movement. You remember that? There was a movement, and then they were all arrested. There was a... Falun Gong. Sorry, thank you very much. Falun Gong. They're really scared of Falun Gong having 100 million followers in China, and they're really scared of Dalai Lama in India having so many followers that they realize that you cannot fight spirituality. You might as well have a homegrown, made in China spirituality that people can have. So they are doing it that way. I also hear claims that the Christians have made huge inroads underground, kind of. The Chinese are saying that as long as the authority is not reporting to a Western source, and as long as these are people that are all Chinese appointed from locally, not foreign appointed, and no funding coming in, under those terms they're saying it's okay. So there are those kind of Christian movements supposedly doing very well, but you don't have transparency of statistics, so you really don't know. Yeah.
So, how do you think the Gandhian idea of being non-violent would help the present India or the present world tackle the deep-rooted terrorism around the world? I mean, one of the powerful nations as United States is trying to fight back terrorism, why not it retain to the non-violent movement in fighting back terrorism?
Good point. It's a very difficult question we also discussed in the interview this morning. I don't believe necessarily that what Gandhi thought 100 years ago is applicable today in every sense. Okay? It is, so I don't think we should become Gandhi dogmatists that says that what he did we should do, because that would not even be in the spirit of being an original thinker, out of the box, pragmatic thinker. We have to think for today. But if you were to use a certain principle, the principle of bringing the community together against the Dharma, then the Gandhian way would be that you bring those Muslims together with you who say that they don't like Islamic terrorism because they feel that that is an insult to Islam. A lot of Muslims go on television and say that, from Fareed Zakaria on to a lot of people will go around saying that, true Islam doesn't like terrorism and we don't believe that jihad is violence. They talk like that. So the Gandhian thing to do would be to bring them and say, okay, now you guys should help fight those guys. There ought to be an Islamic army fighting, or an Islamic mobilization collecting together and fighting, not just verbally condemning on television when you have to for politically correct reasons, but they ought to be out there at the vanguard fighting against Islamic terrorism if they truly believe that that is a dharma. So getting the Muslims on your side to fight terrorism as a dharma, Islamic terrorism as a dharma, would be a very important thing to do. And by that it would require charisma, it would require persuasion, it would require working with people, it would require engaging them, confronting them, challenging them to take this up. And there's another thing that I want to mention. Gandhi was asked, what if peaceful satyagraha fails and there's a trampling all over you? He said, rather than being a coward who is taking defeat willingly, I would be willing to take up arms and fight. He did say that. But that would be his last resort. Any other questions?
Any other questions? If not, I think Rajiv has given us enough material to read so much that our eyes need lens, and if we need lens, I guess we go to Mahatma Gandhi's lens. Thank you very much. Giving our speakers a token of appreciation. Thank you very much.